And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, where we design and develop and deliver professional development to schools and educators around the world. You can find our information at wegrowteachers.com. That's our website, TeachThought PD website. And of course, our main website for all of our blogging content is at teachthought.com. If you have any questions about this podcast or have suggestions or guest suggestions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is drew@teachthought.com. And of course, we always encourage you to share and review the podcast in places that are important for others to see, so that helps us get better guests and bring more content to you that hopefully helps you prepare learners for the modern world. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Maria Hyler, who is the Deputy Director in the Washington, D.C. office and Senior Researcher at Learning Policy Institute. The center of our conversation was a new book by Linda Darling Hammond and Jeannie Oakes, in which she had a hand in helping to create. It's called Preparing Teachers for Deeper Learning, and clearly this is a topic in which I have lots of interest, and we have lots of interest as we work to provide professional development for teachers to teach for deeper learning. So we touched on some of the research that they used for the book, as well as some of the hallmarks of the 7 exemplar teacher prep programs that they looked at. I asked her about some teacher aptitude and skills, as well as how an apprenticeship type of model might be helpful, and also whether leaders are really able to provide leadership in deeper learning. So we touched on those pieces, as well as contextualizing learning and the role of knowledge, which is always something that I wonder about in constructivist education. Then we went on to talk about the always important issues of social justice and equity, and explored that a little bit and how we can make that happen in a way that's productive and meaningful, and some of my concerns, as well as support and policy changes that we might need to implement in order to make this sustainable. And then we finished our conversation talking about teacher pay and how we might restructure incentives to attract and retain really great teachers. So I found the conversation to be useful and interesting, and I hope you do as well. Enjoy. Welcome, Maria, to the podcast. Happy to have you here. You're joining us from Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. office for the Learning Policy Institute. I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself so they have some context for our conversation that is to come.
Sure. Thank you. Actually, first, thank you very much, Drew, for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of our research and the initiatives that we have going on. As for myself, I'm the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office and a Senior Researcher here at the Learning Policy Institute. I also direct our new initiative called the Educator Preparation Laboratory, or EdPrep Lab, which focuses on teacher and leader preparation for deeper learning. But prior to coming to the Learning Policy Institute, I had a life in public education. I started out as a high school English teacher in San Mateo, California. During my 5 years teaching there, I became National Board Certified in Adolescent Young Adult English Language Arts. And as I taught, I decided to go in equities in the schooling system that I wanted to know more about and have an impact on. So I went back, got my doctorate, and I did teacher preparation at the University of Maryland for several years before coming to the Learning Policy Institute about 3.5 years ago, where I've been focused on most issues in educator quality. So that's a little bit about my background.
Okay, and one of the main pieces that we're going to talk about is a new book that you had a hand in helping to create with Linda Darling Hammond and Jeannie Oakes, called Preparing Teachers for Deeper Learning, which is certainly near and dear to the work that we try to do, because we're constantly trying to work with teachers in professional development and leaders in professional development towards what we would call deeper learning, or preparing schools for the modern world. But this book is based in some research that you all have done. So tell us a little bit more about that research.
Mm-hmm. And I actually should give a little context about what we do at Learning Policy Institute. We exist primarily to close the gap between research and policy at the state and federal level. So we gather, conduct, and disseminate high-quality research, in particular to policymakers, in a way that they can consume it. So a lot of briefs and events. And the purpose of that is so that each and every child will have access to a high-quality education. And that's kind of the genesis of this study. We know that one of the primary, the largest impact of student learning is the teacher in the classroom. So we're looking at how are teachers best prepared, in particular, best prepared for deeper learning. So we identified 7 teacher preparation programs from across the country that were doing this work well. And we had a whole selection process to do that. And there were 7 programs that were geographically diverse, as well as diverse in their size, public-private, traditional or alternative, and diverse in their size. So we just wanted to look at, a group of programs that were doing this work well, that exemplified the fact that teacher preparation can be done well in any variety of contexts. So we went to these programs and spent 2 to 3 days just visiting, sitting with professors, interviewing and surveying alumni, current teacher candidates, faculty partners, K-12 partners, and just got to see the how of teacher preparation for deeper learning. So we weren't interested in proving that they were doing it well, because we already had identified the fact that they were, but really wanted to dig in deep and get to the how of it, so that people really understood the practices and the ways in which teacher preparation programs were able to really get teachers to be able to understand how to teach for deeper learning from the first day in the classroom.
Well, it's fascinating. I think that there's no secret, or I've made no secret at least my frustration and sort of amazement in the teacher preparation programs on whole, seeming to be ironically sort of poor. I mean, we work with brand new teachers coming out of teacher prep programs on project-based learning and inquiry, and we're pretty regularly seeing them say, I've never heard of project-based learning, or certainly not in any meaningful way, and it just strikes me as bizarre and sad and odd. And knowing that there are some programs that are, like you said, some exemplars, I think you call them 7 exemplars in the book here, that are doing it and doing it well. And so then using this book and research to think about how we, I guess, scale that. And I mean, it's an imperative. We've got to get our teachers to be better, and that's not to denigrate or be overly critical or unnecessarily critical, but we have to be critical of our profession and our work in ways that will help move it forward and help, again, students be prepared for what's coming at them. So what are some of those things that were hallmarks and you saw that sort of transcended and transferred across those 7 exemplars?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, there's a variety of pathways into teaching, and there's a variety of quality of programs. So we were excited to see the programs that were doing this work well. And there is definitely some hallmarks to what they were doing. And I won't hit them all at once, but we can perhaps circle around to them. But in particular, I want to highlight most importantly that the programs were modeling the types of learning environments and practices that they wanted to see their teacher candidates enact in their own K-12 classrooms. And that's key because we talk about deeper learning, we talk about project-based learning and inquiry, and these practices that we want our students to experience in their K-12 lives, but forget the fact that most of us have not experienced that type of learning in our K-12 experiences. I know I didn't. I had very traditional teachers in my classes, and so when I went to be a teacher, that's all I knew and what I knew to enact, unless I had an experience that was different from that. So these teacher preparation programs really were committed to high quality practices in their own faculty, and those faculty were modeling and making explicit those practices for their teacher candidates so that the candidates can then experience, wow, this is what inquiry-based learning feels like, looks like, is. This is what project-based learning looks like, feels like, and is. Because it's very hard to do something that you yourself have never experienced. So that was one of the key pieces that we saw happening in these preparation programs. Did you have any questions there, or should I go on to some of the other ones?
Yeah, it is interesting that dichotomy that you mentioned of so many teachers having experience in K-12 and beyond a fairly traditional model. Although I will say that I would guess that most teachers and most students probably had at some point some teacher along the way that was episodic in ways that really stood out was probably more constructivist and probably more inquiry based and those pieces. So they probably had some glimpse into it, and it probably very likely excited them and would be something that they would remember, as opposed to this sort of very traditional teacher-led didactic approach at worst, sort of the drill and kill, but then there's some middle ground in between that and constructivist education, somebody being, really thoughtful about their practice.
Mm-hmm. We would hope so. And I think for me, as a new teacher, that meant having lots of activities that weren't necessarily best practices, because activities, when we dig deeper into what some of these best practices were at the teacher preparation programs, is that they had these tight partnerships with K-12 districts and really rich clinical experiences that tied theoretical coursework to real life experiences in the classrooms. And so oftentimes new teachers have fun activities that are engaging and constructivistic, but they're not tied necessarily, right, to mastering content knowledge, to thinking critically and solving complex problems, it's not built on the science of learning and development. And so what happens, you have these experiences that don't get students to actually learn deeply. And I think that's part of what has been key in these programs, is the understanding of the child and youth development, how people learn, the new brain science research that's been available to teacher preparation programs. All these elements of really understanding how students learn, understanding that you need to know your students well and their communities, and to be able to make culturally relevant and rigorous experiences for your students. That's the kind of thing that you get within high quality preparation that you don't see necessarily being enacted, even with a teacher who might have had some constructivist leanings, or who might have had engaging activities for students in K-12. And at times, and it doesn't have to be a dichotomy, but oftentimes young people go into teaching because they've had this one teacher who made a difference in their lives. And oftentimes that's because of the learning that takes place, but more often than not, it's about that relationship that the teacher was able to create with the student. And that is core to a lot of what the teacher preparation programs in this study were really focused on, helping the teachers to be able to cultivate, really understanding students, their families, the communities they come from, their culture, their language, what their lived experiences were, and also understanding their own selves in that space, like who they were. Teacher candidates were asked to spend time thinking about their own positionality in many of these programs. And in particular, we know that the teaching force is primarily white and female, and our student population is becoming increasingly racially, ethnically, linguistically diverse. So like, what does that mean for me as a teacher to go into these spaces? So really taking a critical stance and thinking about all the ways in which you need to show up as a teacher in the increasingly complex society that we are now a part of, not only locally, but nationally and globally as well.
Right. So there's two things that jump into my thought process here as you're talking, thinking about, and I've wondered this aloud, I think, in the podcast and certainly outside of the podcast, but I wonder when we think about teaching and our teaching force, certainly part of that is attracting and retaining high quality teachers, but I sometimes wonder and think about how, like, is there a specific set of skills or an aptitude that folks need to have in order to be a really high quality teacher? And I guess as sort of a subset of that question are those skills something that can readily be developed over time, which then leads me to the other part in this multi-part question that I'm posing is, and I know in the book it talks a bit about sort of apprenticeship and learning communities and those kinds of models that, as you mentioned. So I reflect on my teaching career of 15 years, and certainly in the early part of my teaching career, there were things that I did that I think, wow, I was doing some more activity kind of things and much less really thoughtful, intentional teaching connected to deeper learning in ways. But it was probably more engaging and hopefully more engaging than the didactic and all of those things. So it strikes me as like there's a general evolution of good teaching as it gets better, but there's also seems to be an aptitude or sort of a processor speed that might be really, I don't know if it's necessary, certainly helpful, and maybe necessary in order to make that evolution and growth over time, whether it's within a sort of a mentor or learning community or not.
So what your questions, your multi-part question
right.
Brings up for me is the fact that there is a set of knowledge, skills, and dispositions, basically, that teachers need. And it was interesting across the 7 programs that we studied, some, their focus was on the recruitment of people who displayed particular knowledge, skills, and dispositions before entering the program. And so they were really interested in teachers who they felt demonstrated some cultural responsiveness or critical thinking or a clear learning stance, right? And then other programs were not as focused on the recruitment, but really thinking through how do we then, we're going to be able to interview for some of those knowledge, skills, and dispositions, but we're not going to be able to catch all of that in an interview process. So how are we going to ensure that they have the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that you're talking about? Mm-hmm. And I think it's that experiential learning. It's having the secure knowledge base of the theory of learning and development and the knowledge of teaching and pedagogy and curriculum and instruction, and then being able to engage in that work deeply over a really sustained period of time. So part of what we saw in these programs is that they had really rich, lengthy clinical experiences. So it wasn't the typical semester of student teaching that you see in a lot of programs, but some of these programs had up to a year clinical experience with their teacher candidates in schools, doing field work from the very beginning of their programs, and then doing gradual release into their final semesters of preparation. So the type of thoughtful curriculum and coursework and experience were hallmarks of these programs. So there was a developmental trajectory of learning for teacher candidates in these programs, understanding that they're coming in as novices, and then how do we get them at the end of their program to be ready day one for teaching in their classrooms.
Would you say that those skills and traits and dispositions, so if I'm a high school principal or any level principal, but I'm in charge of hiring, or I'm looking for teacher candidates, which is perhaps increasingly more challenging to find really good teacher candidates because of the pool maybe shrinking or how we have set up the pay structure and all those things. But as you're thinking about trying to find and attract and interview really good teachers for your school, assuming that the underlying assumption here is that you're after deeper learning and that your stance on that as a principal or hiring person is consistent with what you and I probably would agree is deeper learning. So would you say those skills and traits and dispositions are the same or very, very similar in the hiring process as it is to identifying teacher prep candidates?
I would say yes. And I would say that the hiring process can be assisted in seeing those knowledge, skills, and dispositions in a way that you can't when you're recruiting candidates, because we know a lot of the programs, the high quality programs, are using performance assessments in their programs. So teacher candidates graduate with actually a portfolio of their work, often with videos of themselves teaching, really structured analysis of their teaching that is much more compelling than a sit-down interview. And a interview committee can actually have a pretty good sense of a teacher by reading through their materials, as well as perhaps having a demonstration lesson. So I think it's becoming easier for principals to hire teachers who would teach for deeper learning. But interestingly enough, one of the findings that we had from our teacher preparation for deeper learning study that resulted in the book, Preparing Teachers for Deeper Learning, is that teachers would be prepared to teach in these innovative ways and then get hired in schools by principals who were unable to support them to teach that way, whether it be because of the structure of the school and the school day, the lack of collaborative time for teaming, or just not a vision of deeper learning themselves as a leader. That actually caused us to do a study on leadership preparation for deeper learning, because we wanted to know, well, what's going on with principals that they're not able to have this vision of deeper learning or support teachers who want to teach in that way. And so we actually studied 5 leadership preparation programs to see what were best practices in leadership preparation. And so we're hoping through the efforts of the Ed Prep Lab to be able to bring together teacher and leader preparation programs and bring more cohesion to the field and spread some of these practices for deeper teacher and leader preparation for deeper learning.
Yeah, it's a really tough nut to sort of figure out how to crack, and we're working with leadership and schools and trying to think about how do we do that as well. So we're not a university, but we offer professional development, and I'm becoming more and more convinced that with teachers and with leadership, that engaging them in non-pedagogy specific but really rich thinking and inquiry constructivist experiences where they're really being pushed to think on pieces of inquiry or school choice or equity. For example, we just did our pre-conference day for our Grow 19 conference, which is centered around project-based learning, but the pre-conference day, which was with the National School Reform faculty, using protocols to sort of dive more deeply into things like school choice and equity. So asking really hard questions and getting them to process them. And so to me, it's like flexing that muscle, and then hopefully we as teachers would transfer that into our practice as teachers, but also in that leadership strand and getting away from this really what seems to be, you talk about this sort of standard interview where it's, I don't know what the questions, it's been a long time since I was in a teacher interview, but, you can imagine those standard questions that are very typical and not particularly revealing, and you're just sort of really guessing at whether or not this is a good fit as a teacher, and if this is even a good fit for you as a school. And so
Right.
shifting that practice and shifting that, and as we work with leadership, some of those things you mentioned, like how do we get them to sustain the work and have that vision and mission and sustain it past just a year or two, because it just doesn't seem to do that regularly. And then consider what are the systems and practices, and let's really clarify what is our purpose, and those pieces that are really so often just, it's almost like they're ignored.
Yeah, for sure. You just remind me of my own hiring experience. I graduated with my master's in teaching credential, and I went to a fair, like a hiring fair, and there was a district there. I was in Cambridge, and there was a district there from California with a table. And after speaking to me for 15 minutes, they gave me a signed commitment for contract. So I had a guaranteed job in their district, and they only spoke to me for 15 minutes. And that was quite shocking for me as a new teacher. They didn't know enough about me to know if I was the right fit for them.
They're just looking for warm bodies.
Exactly. So,
which, to be fair, is a challenge of schools today, is finding candidates, let alone highly qualified candidates.
It's true. We do know that there are teacher shortages across the country, and in particular subject areas and specifically. But what it sounds like you're doing is providing those deeper learning experiences for teachers and principals that allow them to think critically and to problem solve. And so that's important around teacher professional development. But we also saw in our leadership for deeper learning study that the principals were having content specific learning opportunities as well, because that helped them to be able to go into teachers' classrooms with a real eye for student learning and instructional, high quality instructional practices. And a lot of principals need that practice and that ability to understand, when I go into a math teacher's class, what kinds of things should I be seeing? What should I be hearing the students talk about? What kind of questions should the teacher be asking? So we found that was evident in our leadership preparation for deeper learning study.
Is there any, if you were to have to hazard a guess in the United States of school administrators, K-12, and this is again hazarding a real guess, how many of those school administrators would you guess have a real clear sense of what deeper learning is, in a way that they could provide real instructional leadership to get there?
So you never ask a researcher to hazard a guess. But I will say this, that there's two pieces. There are the principals who have the knowledge and the skills of what deeper learning is and seek to support their teachers in enacting that deeper learning in their classrooms with supports, not just like emotional support, first of all, just like the encouragement to try new things and take risks, but also like structures and making sure that there's time to collaborate and there's time to do this work well. So there's those principles, but in addition, there's policy challenges to do that type of work well, even if you have the knowledge as a principal. So one of the things that we really think about are what are the policies that might support this type of work? Teachers preparing teachers for deeper learning and leaders, because there's often a climate and a culture and that does not support principals doing this work or teachers doing this work. And so when we look at principals, they have a lot of challenges to enacting the types of knowledge that they might have. So we can, I'm always hesitant to say that principals don't know about this, but some might not have the knowledge, but some might not have the structures in place to support that knowledge.
Yeah, and I would say there's probably a third element there that is they may know about it and have a sense of it as important, just as a broad strokes, and there's certainly some policy and some things that are holding them back in ways that we certainly need to be shifting and changing, but also it seems to me to be a real potential problem, and it's weird, so what we do often is take teachers and promote them to administrators, which is sometimes that works, but not always, because that's a different skill set in lots of ways, although I'm not sure how different it should be. There's certainly some debate to be had there, and in that discussion it's almost like, what is the purpose of school? Because essentially leaders should be support staff for teachers, just the way that teachers should be support staff for their learners in their classroom, but often it's not seen as that role.
Right. And actually, there's a great example. Long Beach Unified School District in California has an excellent pipeline into their leadership, because what they've done is they've doubled down on teacher professional development and have a really robust teacher professional learning culture in the district, and a career lattice for teacher leadership where teachers can practice leadership in multiple ways and have different flexible job roles that allow them to teach as well as coach, or teach as well as learn the skills and knowledge that a principal or assistant principal might need. So they have this robust teacher professional development, teacher leadership, and then attached to that, they have a administrative pipeline in the district. So the teachers that are, quote unquote, admitted into this leadership pipeline have had to prove themselves as excellent teachers and really knowledgeable teachers who know how to teach for deeper learning. And then they can go into the administrator pipeline after getting an administrator's credential through a university, of course. But Long Beach has really created a system where they have leaders now that have really deep pedagogical knowledge, so that as they lead, they can support their teachers in becoming really high quality teachers in those spaces, because they have that eye and knowledge, plus the additional support of what are the knowledge and skills needed as an effective principal or leader.
Yeah, it seems like there's a set of leadership skills that certainly could and probably does apply highly to a really well-designed and good classroom, but there's probably some leadership skills that are maybe a different set of skills outside of a classroom teacher, and part of that is the old sort of dichotomy of the principal that makes sure the lights are on and the buses are on time versus instructional leadership, and both of those things are clearly important, as well as some of the policy pieces. And yeah, it's really hard. I wrote a blog piece and published it a month ago or so, something basically it's why we should make it easier to be a teacher, not harder. And really that's the idea there, is thinking through how do we want teachers to be able to do their best work and to do great work, and it seems like it's just increasingly harder. I know when I left the classroom in 2012, I was ready to be out of that classroom because I felt like it was so hard for me to do what I thought was great work. And part of that was the policies, part of that was the leadership, part of that was the system. And part of that was the fellow teachers and the culture and the climate, and perhaps even me. But removing those barriers and thinking how, as a leader, you can do that. And in some ways, I suppose the teacher preparation is there's a part of that as well.
Absolutely. I think what you're talking about is just the professionalization of teaching.
Right.
Teachers, in a lot of ways, are not being treated as professionals. A lot of policies seek to control teachers and control curriculum. And, if we put our trust in teachers, their professionalism, their skills, and knowledge, then there would be able to do a lot more than they are currently able to do with the constant looking for ways to control and to minimize. It seems like many policies are out to minimize harmful impact as opposed to maximize positive impacts that teachers can have on students and in schools.
Right. And I would say, and I have said many times, I think if parents understood deeper learning and what schools could and should be, then they would demand that policies and policymakers would shift their perspective. But as it is, as sort of like we mentioned earlier, is, teachers went through pretty traditional classrooms, and obviously then so would have parents have gone through that. And so I think the sort of glittering generalization of, yes, I'm for a great education. Of course, we all are, and that's an easy way to get around the fact that we need our schools on whole to really shift practice, and our teaching profession to shift practice. And I don't know that is part of that school choice debate that I constantly bring up, is that school choice is certainly, I think, a wonderful thing, and I exercise it, but I worry about, and I'm people will say I'm paternalistic, but like, do parents really understand what great teaching and learning could and should look like, and how much do they factor that into the decision in school choice, which of course is it's part of the larger ecosystem and conversation.
Mm-hmm. We have a report that we released about the tapestry of school choice, and it really is about having schools worth choosing, right? All schools should be worth choosing, and we need to think about how to get to a system to do that, and key to that is the preparation of teachers and leaders for deeper learning.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the contextualizing of learning. I know that's a chapter in the book, and certainly something that we talk about, especially in the no pun intended context of project-based learning. But how does that apply in the teacher preparation programs?
Mm-hmm. Sure thing. So it's multi-layered. So when we think about best teaching practices, first of all, as a teacher candidate, you want to as a teacher preparation program, you want to ensure that your teacher candidates are learning in a contextualized manner. So you want them to have the types of experiences, to be in the types of schools, to interact with students, families, and communities in ways that will mimic the types of schools and spaces in which the teacher candidate will eventually go. So that means the really tight partnership with K-12 districts, and really helping teacher candidates to understand and know their students well, their communities, their families, and to embed that learning in the way that they design curriculum and they implement pedagogy in their classrooms. So first of all, you want to contextualize teaching, learning to teach for teacher candidates. And second of all, you want to teach teacher candidates how to contextualize this teaching and learning for their own students. So getting to know students and their communities and family members, their cultures, their languages, their identities, isn't just to be able to connect with them and to have authentic relationships, which is very important. It's also needed to be able to create curriculum that speaks to students, that links to their prior knowledge and skills, that links to their personal experiences and background experiences. So when we think about students' cultures or communities, the best type of teaching and learning allows students to see themselves in that curriculum and see their own is. So a lot of folks talk about windows and mirrors. So the mirror is that the student can see themselves in a curriculum, and the window is that they also have the opportunity to experience and learn about different cultures and different experiences themselves. So when you contextualize teaching and learning for students, you really help them to see that learning is something that they do every day. They are engaged in critical thinking and problem solving in their everyday lives, and that teacher candidates need to learn how to connect the academic learning that's occurring in the schools with what's happening in their everyday lives. And in the best way possible, you see those lines blurred. So when you have a teacher who creates a community garden and their students are learning about the environment and the ecosystem in the community garden, and then they can pick the food and eat the food and have community chefs talk about how to prepare the food. So the best way to contextualize is to blur those lines, but of course there's a continuum. So if you're connecting and you're providing mirrors for students for them to see themselves in that learning, that's really what contextualized teaching and learning is about.
So is it in the realm of what I sometimes say, and you mentioned content mastery earlier, and one of the things that I think about with content mastery is I think it's often sort of unrealistic that certainly it's a worthwhile ideal, I suppose, that we have kids leaving all of our classes and all of our schools content masters of all of the content, but I think that's pretty unrealistic. I don't know of any teacher, myself included, who have ever achieved that ideal where you have any kid leaving with an expert knowledge of AP psychology, and I use that word expert explicit or intentionally versus expertise. And so I guess my real question here is about the role of knowledge, and thinking about when we think about expert versus expertise. And I don't particularly like it when people introduce me, for example, to a group as being an expert in something, because that means I sort of have all the answers, which I certainly don't. I don't know everything about anything. There's just a list of questions longer than I could imagine about things that I have expertise in. So I think about and learn about and sort of travel in the cognitive terrain of teaching and learning quite regularly, and social studies as a social studies teacher. So I wanted my kids to be able to think like historians or whatever that sort of role is, which means, of course, that you have to have and develop appropriate and operational content knowledge as opposed to knowing all of that stuff. And so when you think about the role of knowledge in deeper learning, how does that play out?
Yeah, so I think that there's content standards. So I do think it's possible for if you're in fourth grade or fifth grade, there's some content standards that kids can learn and teachers can teach, and
absolutely should.
Right, but for deeper learning, it is more than that. And one of the competencies around deeper learning is this idea of academic mindsets and metacognition, learning how to learn, and having students to understand themselves as learners and to learn to persevere, have a growth mindset in the face of challenges. So when I think about knowledge, what's important about deeper learning and content mastery is the ability to transfer and apply knowledge. So that whole piece around project-based learning that you were talking about earlier sits right in the middle of this deeper learning. It doesn't matter if a student memorizes 4 times 4 is 16, right? You need to understand conceptually that if I had 4 groups of 4 peanuts, and I count them out, that equals 16. And so this idea that I can understand a content and a concept well enough to be able to apply it and then transfer it to a new situation is what deeper learning is about. And that's how, when I was talking about the example of the community garden, which actually took place in a high classroom, they were learning about biological concepts as they were tilling the soil and planting the plants and learning how to ensure that these plants were growing. And then as they were, eventually picking them and creating tasty dishes, they were applying and transferring some of the scientific and biological concepts to this kind of hands-on real-world learning that was taking place. So I would say knowledge is really not about a static set of facts, figures, and information, but it's really a dynamic use of information that you can then take to different settings and different contexts and be able to employ in different ways.
Right. I did a podcast with a Kentucky University, Morehead State University professor, Tim Simpson, and he was actually one of the keynote speakers at our conference last week, and I asked him to talk about some of the things, the main sort of takeaways, and one of the big takeaways that I thought was really interesting in his podcast with me is this role, what he called focal knowledge versus tacit knowledge, which is that usable knowledge and transferable and being able to apply it in different situations. And he had pulled from a guy named Michael Polanyi. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I wasn't. From the 1950s, I think, is the studies. And it's a really thoughtful way to think about knowledge as I guess, because constructivist, inquiry-based, sort of deeper learning, which falls in that universe, gets rightfully criticized in some circles of education because they say you're foregoing knowledge, which I jokingly say, that would be, sort of free range chicken. Like you're saying, here's a challenge, here's a question, go construct the knowledge, and we'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks, kids, and let's see what you've learned, which is certainly not what we're after. That's not what we would say is deeper learning. I'm sure that's not what you would say is deeper learning, but it does happen, just like there are really poor examples of very traditional didactic teaching that happen. So the importance of doing deeper learning and doing it well is really crucial in this evolution as we shift, because it's easy to cast blame on this sort of teaching that we're talking about when it's not done correctly or done well, because there are real shortcomings, and we've seen schools where that's happened. My guess is you've seen schools where that's happening, so it's really incumbent upon us to get this right.
Mm-hmm. And to get it right for all students. I think at the heart of deeper learning for us is deeper learning for all students, because you would often see this type of learning in more resourced schools and schools that have access to more money, more resources, all those types of important material things, and that you would not see this in schools that are rural, that are schools that are in communities that have low SES, and not in often schools that are primarily students of color. So for us, a primary focus of this deeper learning initiative is really ensuring that all students have access to deeper learning, and teachers and leaders who have the ability to provide deeper learning environments, no matter where their school is located.
Yeah, so you have a chapter on equity and social justice that I think is worth diving into, but that brings me back to the school choice piece that I have a real concern about, because I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that I think that school choice often ends up in low SES communities being schools that are really hyper-focused on getting kids diplomas and into college, that often don't address deeper learning, don't build skills, but it does get them into college. And again, you have parents who think, well, that's certainly, and it probably is, better than some of the educational environments in which they might have to sort of suffer through, because let's face it, some of those low SES schools are really not getting the work, the culture and climate, and the work is not what we want it to be, anywhere near what we want it to be. So as an alternative, it's certainly a better choice to have a more structured, rigid environment where it's focused on those test scores and getting kids diplomas and getting them admitted into college. But it's lacking those deeper learning experiences that you mentioned. Would you agree with that? Are you finding that, or is there some difference there?
I think it goes back to what I was saying before, like really having schools worth choosing when you think about school choice, and schools having teachers who are well prepared and leaders who are well prepared. And I think it's happening in small pockets. So the Educator Preparation Laboratory, which I brought up earlier, is a collection of 15 preparation programs, both teacher and leader preparation programs. And they're doing some impressive things in terms of preparing teachers and leaders for a diversity of contexts, and in particular being very thoughtful about preparing teachers for particular school districts, like the San Francisco Teacher Residency program is preparing teachers for San Francisco public schools. The University of Illinois at Chicago are preparing principals for Chicago public schools. And they're doing a really good job of helping teachers and leaders to understand the particular context that they're going into, to think about particular challenges, but more importantly, to think about the opportunities that are available and the richness of the cultures that they'll engage with and the assets of their students and communities, and really thinking about how to enter spaces that might have challenges, but really be open to the opportunities and ways in which they can create these deeper learning environments in schools and districts that may not have traditionally been spaces of deeper learning. So I'm encouraged that there are places that are doing this work. The purpose of the Ed Prep Lab is really to bring together programs that are doing this work well, and to help to spread and disseminate best practices that they are engaged in, to help other teacher and principal preparation programs to learn about these practices, as well as working with policymakers to advance policies that actually make it easier for this type of preparation to take place, as opposed to policies that sometimes hinder high quality preparation.
Right. So one of the chapters is Teaching for Equity and Social Justice, and it's something that I'm deeply interested in, because I believe that we're only as strong as our ability to build capacity in our weakest links, and making sure, like you said, that all people have the opportunities to learn. But I find it to be a real challenge in thinking about how we do this productively and balance the work in productive ways between, sort of clearly we're in a culture war, and just in general, not just in schools, but thinking about what's going on in politics and our media and all of those things. And so doing social justice and equity work that's meaningful, and balancing that with some of the, I guess, to use some of the terminology, the sort of ultra left wokeness that gets into the call-out culture that feels like it makes it so hard to talk about some of these things. And even just in this conversation, me saying what I'm saying, I feel like there's some danger in that, because it does get into that sort of call-out culture and sort of that conversation that doesn't seem to be very productive. So how do we balance that in ways that are meaningful but thoughtful?
I think there's a lot of ways to do that, and a lot of our programs in the Ed Prep Lab and in our studies are navigating that quite well. And I think there's a lot of practices to support a focus on equity and social justice in teacher and leader preparation. In particular, starting with the individual and understanding him or herself going into the space and their own position of privilege and power, whether it be racial, gender, identity, and then understanding how that interacts with a classroom and a school or parents and community. So really taking a deep look at yourself, your own biases, the ways that you see the world and understand the world. And then also some explicit instruction around social foundations. It's impossible to fight against systems of oppression if you don't understand the historical, the social, the economic realities that have impacted schooling in America and continue to impact schooling in America. So programs explicitly help teacher candidates and leader candidates to understand all of these different elements and how that shows up in schools and classrooms, how that shows up and creates inequities in schooling and schools, so that teachers and leaders really understand systems as opposed to looking and seeing individual deficits. They really are able to understand how systems have resulted in such gross inequities in schools and classrooms, and then give them the tools to fight against and interrupt those inequities. In particular, starting with and thinking about student assets and seeing the opportunities and the knowledge and the greatness that are in students in schools, in students and families and communities, and then tapping into that and being able to then link that learning through those authentic relationships to advance student learning. A really important part of the science of learning and development is that students can learn only when they feel when they're in safe identity safe spaces. And so if a student is going into a classroom where they're expected to have their identities, their racial, their gender, their sexual identities being attacked, then that's going to shut down their learning. And these programs and our studies in the network really seek to help teachers and leaders understand the necessity of creating identity safe spaces and to really interrogate their own identities around social identifications that I've just talked about. So the work's being done. It's very difficult, and it's a work that needs to continually develop because society continually changes. So I really appreciate the programs that are being proactive and really thinking about their own practices, thinking about the best ways in which to create spaces where teacher and leader candidates are challenged to think about their own identities and their own biases and to confront those in ways that are productive and allow them to engage in advocacy for students, communities, and schools.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing, and as I'm listening to you, I'm imagining some of the pushback that folks might give, and I think probably more so at the university level, which of course is where teacher prep is, but thinking about how that filters down into the K-12 and I think it's really important to empower all kids, however their identity is or however they're identifying, and doing that with inquiry and thinking about how we get their questions into the room and their voice into the room, and thinking about kids and not how smart are they, but how are they smart, but there's also, you mentioned safe spaces and some of those pieces around the equity things and oppression, which are certainly real and really worth examining and being thoughtful and asking questions about. But how do we keep that, at least, from getting into sort of crossing the line where it's not practical, where it's not helpful? The idea that some people would push back and say, look, you're creating an environment potentially where people are looking for ways in which they are oppressed and looking for ways in which they are being discriminated against, and whether they may or may not be there, but how productive is that? And that's what I would guess would be some of the major pushback, and how you think about teacher preparation, of course, then filters out into our teaching population. And have you had conversations about that?
In general, the pushback that we heard did not focus on that, because if you start with students' lived experiences, it's hard, kind of what you said, not how smart they are, but what was the phrase you used?
How are they smart?
How are they smart? These programs are starting with the students and their lived experiences, and so it's hard to argue with a student who talks about their daily experiences, and then if you start with the students' daily experiences and their lived experiences, you then have a place of you just have a space where you either believe your students and what they're saying is their experiences, and you work to address that, or to understand that, to incorporate that into their learning experiences, or you're rejecting that. And then if you're a teacher earlier who rejects that, it's hard, that student's not going to be able to learn in that environment. So I've not heard of that type of pushback that you're referring to. So I think a lot of these programs just start with understanding and listening, as opposed to creating a narrative or a story about a student or community or families. And so I think that's key, is starting with the knowledge of students and those experiences, and then it's hard to argue with what a student says they're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think that's a smart way to start the conversation. It feels like in the social justice equity space, and it's really hard to tell from social media, because that's, I don't think, a realistic way to gauge what the message and
I would
work
agree.
is. Yeah. But with that disclaimer, when I am on Twitter and seeing, for example, when I read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, I find that to be really difficult to navigate logically. It's unfalsifiable. And then, not that there isn't privilege, certainly there is. We have privilege as being from the United States. There's certain privilege for everybody, but using that as a starting point, and the logic there, that I see some teachers, it feels like they're using that as a starting point. It feels like that is wholly unproductive in so many ways. So when you get on Twitter or whatever, Facebook, and I suppose it's not on Instagram, or maybe it is, I don't know. It worries me that, and I've had this conversation on a number of occasions with people on the podcast in different ways, is it just has to be productive, and we have to be able to talk about things in order to solve the problems that are those things. And when you can't talk about those things for fear of being called out and for fear of being canceled, that just seems like it's a slippery slope into non-productive equity work.
I think a lot of these programs help teacher candidates to navigate that. I think that they have complex conversations about privilege and the ability to talk about things and how to talk about things. And The importance about entry points and having different entry points for different people. I know that I've just been talking about that book in lots of different spaces, and for some people it's life-changing. So if that's an entry point for one person, then great for them, but it might not be an entry point for you per se. And just having the ability to have multiple access points so that everybody can engage in productive conversations, as you say, is very important. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for, in particular, what are the entry points for our students and their families and their communities, and making sure that everyone has entry points into the conversations, because oftentimes those entry points are not for everyone. And so that's some of the things that are important when discussing issues of equity and social justice.
Right. Well, I'm mindful of your time here, but there's a couple other things if we can talk about sort of thinking about the sustainability of this work of preparing teachers for deeper learning, but the last couple chapters of creating supportive structures and then really scaling them, I would imagine that there's a close connection between those two. So if you don't mind, kind of give us the bird's eye view of those pieces.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things that we think about that make sense for teacher leadership preparation and sustainability, it's just, I hate to say common sense, but, we found in these programs that leadership and really prioritized teacher leader preparation. And that meant that they didn't just say teacher preparation is really important here, but they actually had dedicated resources, and they provided funding and human resources as well to the teacher, and leadership preparation program. So really, not only putting their money where their mouth is, right, is what's a real key support structure for doing this work well. Structured high quality partnerships with K-12 districts that went beyond a single person being a liaison between a district, but really systems and structures set up so that K-12 schools and the preparation programs had deep and meaningful relationships. So I'm thinking particularly Montclair State University in New Jersey has a whole center that where the work of K-12 and preparation program partnership takes place, and has a whole menu of professional development opportunities for the teachers and leaders of the schools that they partner with. So really taking time to dedicate time and resources to those important relationships. So it's not just, I need a classroom where I can put a warm body, right? Mm-hmm. You want those deep relationships with schools where you're building the capacity, not only of the teacher candidate, but of the schools where those teacher candidates are going.
Yeah, how do you all, I guess, think about, or what have you found in your research that might be recommendations for teacher pay and restructuring the way in which that might, number one, attract better teacher candidates, as well as retain and grow that practice?
Mm-hmm. So that body of research, we have quite a few research reports on that out of LPI. And when we think about teacher compensation, we think about pay as being one of those compensations, but we actually think about it as like a suite of incentives. So you might have teacher pay, and you would want teachers to get paid a wage that reflects the knowledge and expertise needed to do this challenging, rewarding work. In addition, you could have other things, we have seen programs where there's the loan forgiveness within working in particular schools and districts. You also have seen innovative things like childcare or housing subsidies. So when we think about teacher pay, we want to think about a salary and compensation packages that allow them to live in communities where they teach or near to where they teach, and that they can be able to have a lifestyle where they're not, they are not suffering because of their career choice. Oftentimes, we have teachers who have high debt from their college and their schooling, and it makes it difficult for them to stay in teaching because they're not able to manage financially. So when we think about compensation, we need to think about pay, but also other financial incentives that would help teachers to live a comfortable middle-class lifestyle that was once possible through the teaching profession.
Yeah, it feels like there's a real need for restructuring. One of the things, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who was pushing back a little bit on teacher pay, in noting that if a teacher starts, fresh out of college, early 20s, and teaches for however long they need to teach to get to retirement and then retire, they would be very likely fairly young and middle-aged, I guess. Fairly young is the lifespan of a person, especially as lifespans grow, that pension that a teacher very likely would get if they were in that situation over 20, maybe 30, perhaps more, 40 years, that when you average all of that out, that it's actually a really, really substantial amount of pay per year averaged out. But of course, in that equation there are very few teachers that get to that point, and the other part of it is that, as you mentioned, so a brand new teacher trying to start a family and buy a house and those things, I remember really struggling to, certainly I wasn't poor and could have bought a smaller house. Not that I was in a huge house, but there's always, you say, well, I could have spent less money and would have been okay. But it's kind of what you meant, like a middle class, a reasonable, as a professional, and that's part of the equation here, is like we need to professionalize, and there's some work on teachers that we need to do to be more professional and really be worth that middle class lifestyle that we're talking about. And I'm not phrasing that in a way that probably sounds right, but if we're going to expect teachers, we want teachers to be treated as professionals. Teachers also have to behave and act like real professionals. And just as in any career, there are some who aren't doing what they could and should do. So anyways, my point being that as, let's say mid-20s, if you're six years into teaching, trying to start a family and a house and a picket fence and all of those things that, quote unquote, the American dream, that can be a really challenging salary level. So does it make sense to balance that out a bit more in the front end of it and less in the back end of it? I don't know, but I wonder about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk and a lot of work around teacher residencies now, which is a really promising structure of reducing those costs. And the teacher residencies, for those who don't know, are a full year internship with a teacher candidate, a resident, with a master teacher, a mentor teacher who has been vetted and is knowledgeable and very high quality. And they're paid, they have a living stipend while they're going through their teacher residency, while they're learning how to teach in a particular classroom over a year. And they have loan forgiveness as well. So instead of paying $40,000 for a teacher credential and a master's, they're actually, being supported financially to learn how to teach in a way that's, high quality, with an expectation that they would teach a certain number of years in that district that they're partnering with. So it's a really nice partnership between an Institute of Higher Education and a K-12 school district, saying we're going to work together to ensure that the teachers that you need for your schools are being developed and supported financially, academically, intellectually, and emotionally to be able to learn the things they need to learn without being concerned about financial realities, and then have a guaranteed job in your system when they graduate with loan forgiveness. And they're becoming increasingly more popular because of it just makes sense. Like, we want high quality teachers, and we want teachers to stay in the profession, and to be able to do that, they can't come out with $20,000, $30,000 in debt and get paid $36,000 a year. So
yeah, it's a complicated puzzle, but certainly worth lots of. If it's a Rubik's cube, we got to make a lot of twists and turns here. Well, Maria, I'm mindful of your time. Maria Hyler, Deputy Director for the Washington, D.C. office and Senior Researcher at Learning Policy Institute. The book is Preparing Teachers for Deeper Learning, and we'll put the link to that book. But where else should people find you, and where else should they go to find out anything more that you think is important?
You can check out our website at learningpolicyinstitute.org and follow us on Twitter at LPI_learning.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time. It was a really interesting conversation. Certainly a topic that bears lots of conversation and less conversation and actually more work. So hopefully we can get to that.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Drew. Really appreciated the opportunity to talk about something we're both passionate about.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.